Thank you very much indeed, Bill, and what a fantastic session it's been so far. I wish I'd heard all of this before I'd written my paper, but I will be taking a few comments that I've heard along the way this morning and this afternoon. And I am really more of a kind of specialist in Celtic spirituality and Celtic kind of monasticism and early kind of Christian history in Britain. And I've recently started doing some work on Methodism and outdoor preaching, which at the Susanna Wesley Foundation. And I found, as I started that, a large number of similarities and parallels kind of cropped up, which were more than just a coincidence, I think. I did find several connections between the culture of kind of Celtic spirituality in Western Britain and also in certainly early kind of expressions of Methodism too, which I will go through with my talk. Some of them are, as is so often with kind of cultural similarities, some of them are what you might call superficial. They happen to be very similar in some ways, but I think looking at them and interrogating them quite closely, and also hearing what a lot of people have said today, I think there's more than just a coincidence going on with a couple of them. And I found some very interesting points in my own research, which I'll share with you kind of as concluding kind of big discoveries from my work looking at these two. I think it's very useful, as this seminar has done, to hold kind of two kind of big traditions together, like monasticism and Methodism. I think it's actually quite a productive methodology. So I look at really, I was very taken when Bill earlier on was talking about John Wesley, and how he saw that there was a place for the kind of solitary kind of experience of God. I was looking into this, and I found that it's a problem with, you get writers like Augustine and Aquinas and John Wesley. They write so much that if you dig about through their stuff, you're bound to find things that contradict other things. You're bound to find that's just in the nature of people who write large amounts. So I found that John Wesley had a particular kind of thing about the interplay between solitary religion and the social religion. And this quote here, this is when he was talking kind of in a general public way. He was quite scathing here about solitary religion. He said, "Solitary religion is not to be found in the gospel of Christ. Holy solitaries is a phrase no more consistent with the gospel than holy adulterers. The gospel of Christ knows of no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness." So with that in mind, and the spirit of John Wesley looking rather quizzically over this entire endeavour today, I will go through some of the things I found. I think looking at, as other people have shown, really the idea of an inner dialogue with God, with Jesus Christ, is it's there very much so in kind of the Methodist and his writing as well. In probably more in theology than in practice, because it was a very highly socialized form of religion. So I'll start with some of what I think are maybe slightly superficial or coincidental similarities between early monasticism in Britain and Methodism. The first of which is a simple question of geography. If you look at a map of Celtic Britain, it is really what you call Atlantic Britain. It's over in Wales, it's in the West Country, Cornwall, Devon, and Scotland, and obviously Ireland. I don't know if Harriet's watching this and so on, but listening to Harriet's talk earlier about Irish monasticism, that's a whole new paper. But certainly the West is where Celtic spirituality was most kind of pronounced and most enduring, possibly up until as late as the 10th century in Cornwall, 926, when King Athelstan imposed a kind of Canterbury bishop in Cornwall at St. Germans. And there was also a particularly successful Methodist ministry out in the West too, in Cornwall and Devon, and also in Wales, both heartlands of Celtic spirituality and also places where Methodism found particular traction. There are some of the best Methodist chapels and so on are out there in the West. There's a suggestion I've heard to explain this, is that there are echoes of a nonconformist and independent streak found lingering out in the West, always away from the centres of power, away from London, away from Canterbury. And when spiritual traditions, when sort of new religious traditions are close to the common people, when they're in touch with the concerns very closely of ordinary working men and women, and less concerned with kind of urbanized forms of religion and centers of power, such as the metropolitans and bishops of other church movements, you'll get a kind of expression of spirituality that is a little bit more, shall we say, democratic, a kind of more folk expression in a non-urban society, in places which don't have that kind of cluster of power centers of political power and spiritual power of the cathedrals, of the bishops. And the relationship certainly between geography and ecology and religious belief is well exercised in scholarship. And it's certainly true to say that the fields, hills, valleys of Western Britain are not the place where a religion based on hierarchical power structures and cathedrals are likely to gain much traction. And so it was also, I think, to some extent with John Wesley and the Methodists. Both work well in non-urban settings, is another way of putting it. And there's another very strong cultural expression of spirituality, which almost hardly needs saying, and which is, because it's so obvious, which is, of course, in Celtic and Methodist traditions alike, there's an extremely strong emphasis on song, again, a very popular expression of spirituality. The first hymn writer in the English language, and here's a picture of King David with a harp from Ireland. The Irish harp is one symbol of this kind of Celtic expression of music. And it wasn't just psalms that they sang, the psalms of King David, as we see here. It wasn't just a question of singing psalms. The first writer, hymn writer in the English language, was a man called Cadmon at the Celtic double monastery of Whitby, who was a humble farm worker under St Hilda's authority in the mid-7th century, so early on, and he miraculously received the gift of verse and song. And indeed, all Celtic lands, all Celtic expressions of spirituality that we know have a very big emphasis in the literature of singing. St Columba himself, according to some descriptions, is said to have been exiled from Ireland because of a literary disagreement with some poets, which is quite an eye-catching idea. And it's no exaggeration to say that the singing of all forms of music, and psalms in particular, were kind of like a sort of soundtrack to the early monastic experience. They would sing psalms all the way through for processions, deathbed scenes, liturgies, the establishment of new churches, working in the fields, prophecy, victory celebrations, and many other instances. There are psalms being sung. So pronounced was this great Celtic practice that quite often in stories of early Celtic monasticism, you get the natural world itself joins in. You get birds will sing along to hermits in their hermitages. The breaking of the waves on the shore, they would say their psalms, and it was a kind of common thing to go down to the seashore to say psalms. And my view is that they would use the rhythm of the waves to break up the lines of the psalms, almost kind of doing it like an antiphon with the waves. And also echoes from the mountains themselves would come back, a kind of accompaniment to this early British soundtrack, devotional music, kind of duet with the natural world, very pronounced among the Celtic hermits in particular. And it hardly needs saying to a seminar of people who know far more than me about Methodism and so on, that Charles Wesley and John Wesley also had a bit of an aptitude for turning out the odd poem and hymn, to say the least. This wasn't an expression of communing with nature so much, but it was a very, very highly enculturated form of spiritual belief, which picked up very strongly with folk tradition and culture. So it worked very well. Both of them have that kind of really strong sense of music running through them all, which I think is kind of maybe a superficial link, but I think also talks of their kind of closeness to people, their enculturation. And finally, more importantly, perhaps, and this has been touched on by other speakers as well, is that both church traditions, the Celtic spirituality and Methodism, can be said to have been born in the open air. And this, I think, is where we get closer to something which has some kind of more significance. There was I was reading a paper about the early Methodist meetings from this book by George Dolby, and it's a slightly romanticized vision of early Methodism, I'm sure. But he wrote, the architectural setting of most early Methodist worship was that of nature itself. The grass for its floor, the trees its columns, the sky its roof, and a rock or a hillock its pulpit. And you could write absolutely everything there and delete the word Methodist and put the word Celtic in, and you would you'd have it exactly the same. So there is that sense that there is a kind of real kind of connection to the landscape, to the natural world, very important, certainly in Celtic spirituality. How important it was in Methodism we'll look at now. And it's said that John Wesley, it's certainly true, did spend a lot of time and energy preaching outdoors during the 9 months from April to December 1739, so 9 months of 1 year. He's said to have preached 500 sermons, only 8 of which were delivered inside a church building. So the early Methodist Church was very much, as the facts demonstrate, very much an outdoor church. And this point struck me quite forcefully when I visited one of a very famous preaching place in Winchelsea in West Sussex, which is called the Wesley Tree. I don't know if you can read the sign there, but it's John Wesley preached his last open air sermon here. So you have the Wesley Tree there, and it stood just beyond the boundary wall of the church at Winchelsea. As you can see, it's obviously outside because he was not allowed to go into the church to preach. And here indeed is the tree as the column, as that rather romantic quote said just above. And there's a picture there as well in the British Museum of John Wesley delivering that final sermon there. You can see the church again in the background, and that's the tree, the Wesley Tree. And on my own journeys, I've written a lot about pilgrim places and holy places in Britain. I came across quite a few trees that are dedicated to church leaders. All of them, as far as I'm aware, all these church trees with a name on are linked to Celtic saints' names when they're in a kind of religious tradition. All the way across Britain, early missionaries are linked to numerous places to a great landmark tree. Some famous examples include Oswest's Tree in Shropshire, named after St Oswald's tree, Oswest's Tree, which is an ash tree that allegedly appeared where the saintly king was killed in 642, a Celtic leader. St Etheldreda, who founded the monastery and hence cathedral at Ely, planted another miraculous ash tree at Stowe in Lincolnshire. And there's also, you can still see this one, most of them have long since died, but this is the remains of a yew tree at Congresby in Somerset, supposedly miraculously planted by the Celtic missionary St Congar. And the little red inside this tree, which I think is a beech tree, is the remains of the ancient miraculous yew tree that St Congar planted. So John Wesley is not the first great church leader to have a landmark tree with his name on it, but I think he might be the first for 1,000 years, which alone gives me some pause for thought, because this is unusual. A lot of early church or some medieval church people and later are kind of memorialized much more in buildings and cathedrals and so on. And that really raises the interesting and important question, was this great Methodist embrace of the outdoors, of the parks and the streets, the fields of Britain, was it a deliberate attachment in any way to the natural world, or was it simply a question of practical necessity? I think it's an important point, partly for us in the church today, as we consider really how we connect as Christians, people who worship, meet together and so on, with the natural world. Surely we want to keep the church relevant and prophetic. I think there is a bit of a calling back out to nature again for us. Certainly nearly all church traditions would like to say they're modelled on the practices of the early church. And in fact, you'd be quite hard pressed to find a church that said it wasn't inspired by the early church traditions. And I've read that that the Methodist Church, some scholars have kind of tried to intimate that it was heavily or to some extent influenced or modelled by the early Desert Fathers. Whether or not this is a kind of explanation for the outdoor preaching we'll come on to, but Albert Outler and others have said that there was a kind of monastic feeling, kind of impetus to what inspired John and Charles Wesley, or John Wesley in particular. So we've got this quote here that says, recent scholarship has revealed the surprising extent to which desert spirituality, outdoor spirituality, affected such diverse religious movements as the German evangelicals and pietists in Pennsylvania, Devotion Moderna movement in France, and the Methodist revival in England. So there's a claim that really the kind of Methodist movement was heavily influenced by this desert spirituality, which was, of course, an outdoor spirituality. Early Methodism was known, as we've heard from speakers today, almost monastic-like rigors and structure, its rule of living, canonical hours of prayer, and so on. But I wonder kind of how much of this is actually true in terms of the outdoors, how much there was a real conscious decision to turn to nature and to kind of go and preach beneath trees and so on. And with John Wesley's kind of rejection of solitary holiness, I suspect possibly that this kind of sense that there was a kind of desert spirituality is more to do with John Wesley's reading, particularly his interest in Macarius the Egyptian, Clement of Alexandria, some of the church fathers, and we've looked at some of his other reading as well, more interested in a kind of intellectual ideas rather than a kind of, if you like, a physical embodiment of this impulse to nature, to solitude, to the natural world, to the kind of hermit, nature spirituality. But outdoor worship is definitely, it's a big cultural similarity at least. It's not entirely clear. I've done some research on this, and I'm sure someone much more knowledgeable than me will be able to answer it, is how much, to what extent early Methodist gatherings would go so far as to actually hold a Eucharist in the outdoors. But I haven't managed to find any examples where they did exactly that, but they were certainly open to the idea. Charles Wesley, writing about a communion service he held in 1741 for a congregation of mine workers, used a local school in order to have his Eucharist. But he noted in his journal here, if we had we wanted a house, I would justify doing it in the midst of the wood. So he was obviously open to the idea of holding a communion service in a wood, in a forest. But I have to think, you have to conclude from that, really, this is Charles Wesley possibly making virtue of necessity. So I'm not sure there was a real kind of conscious, meaningful kind of impetus trajectory towards the natural world. Nothing particularly intrinsically good or holy about the natural world for its own sake as a place of meeting and worship, other than the fact that it was for them highly practical and convenient for large meetings, a good way to meet out of a formal setting. And it's interesting just how quickly this idea sort of fizzled out in the kind of Methodist church early on, as it developed. By the 19th century, as we know, by the turn of the 19th century, Methodists had their network of chapels up and down the land. And so there became really the kind of polarity was between church and chapel rather than between church and street or church and park that it had been in the very early period. There was at that point, though, around the sort of turn of the 19th century, one reform-minded preacher suggested implementing a new initiative of holding outdoor camp meetings inspired by what was being done in America. And he also pointed out examples of the Wesley brothers themselves. This is the preacher Hugh Bourne. And he said, we should start holding outdoor love feasts in Britain. We should be gathering and celebrating outdoors, holding large outdoor meetings again, as they did in the early days. And what he promoted actually came up with some rather stiff opposition. Even as early as 1807, you've already got this sense, really, that the actual proper place for meeting should be indoors again. And here we go, the Wesleyan Conference issued this about the subject: it is our judgment, even supposing such meetings to be allowable in America, they are highly improper in England. There we go, and likely to be productive of considerable mischief, and we disdain all connection with them. So that's pretty unambiguous that no, you're not going to be going outdoors to meet anymore. We're going to try and do stuff in the chapel. So there's very much a sense that this early pioneering phase, going out, talking to people in the streets, closed down remarkably quickly within a generation of the death of John Wesley, certainly. It doesn't really need to be added that before long, the primitive Methodists who arose from this, they themselves started building their own chapels, and they quickly got inside as well. So it became a kind of domesticated, a kind of interior churchmanship again, church leadership again. This trajectory of the outdoor meetings did continue in America, and arguably did serve as a kind of prototype. I've heard it claimed by some American Methodists that the way that the camp meetings developed ultimately gave us back was a prototype almost of the modern day church festival. So Greenbelt, Spring Harvest, New Wine would be claimed to be kind of distant cousins of that early Methodist tradition of going outdoors to meet and so on. Well, I'm sure that's probably worth taking anything you can really these days when it comes to religion. I think there is an element of that, this kind of big idea that where we meet and where we find renewal is outdoors. And I do think there is a bigger point that has emerged from this, and it's helped me with some work I'm doing about spirituality, which is with the early Celtic church and with Methodism. I would say that pretty much all renewal movements within Judeo-Christian history, certainly within Christianity, are marked by a period in the outdoors. And I think that's where renewal comes from in the church. We only need to think of John the Baptist and his own message of reform and repentance, preached from the wilderness, to know how embedded that idea is in Christian tradition. Sometimes people are driven outdoors because of persecution, but sometimes not. And desert monasticism and monasticism itself, which emerged from the desert, actually appeared and became very popular at a time when the church itself was not being persecuted, when it was becoming part of the fabric of the state, when it started to become very closely attached to power centres in the Roman Empire. Suddenly then you had this great drive to go out and get away from all of that, all of those distractions. And the Lollards as well were another group who would meet in the outdoors. So it may be a chance, maybe accident, it may be design, but the outdoors and the natural world, for several different reasons, as I say, are where Christianity often goes to be reinvigorated. And I think probably that's where we are now with the church itself, as we look at kind of the current crisis in faith in the West, and also the environmental crisis. I personally see a kind of opportunity opening up for us to kind of reinvigorate and head back out to be close to the natural world. I'm writing a book, researching a book at the moment called Landscape Liturgies for Canterbury Press, looking at all different church traditions, the kind of meetings, rituals, blessings, worship services and so on that took place outdoors, and writing this book that will give people back a kind of resource they can use and so on. So I find it very interesting to kind of think that the parks, fields and forests are where Christianity will find new energy from. Previous renewal movements have got their energy there. And that's very much true of Methodism as it is for Celtic spirituality in particular, and the desert. And then a final, the point I want to end on, which is to put a bit of theology in, which is no bad thing, I trust, which is to look very specifically at something I've studied a lot of, which is the Celtic impulse towards nature as a realm in which to see played out a kind of Christian witness. So as I say, the early Celtic monks and nuns would go into the natural world in a very intentional way. They would seek out nature and so on, and have the trees would be named after them and so on, because they were there kind of planting their faith, rooting their faith in the soil, literally so with the trees. But also there's many places in the landscape where we have caves, islands, rivers, hills, mountains and so on, where Celtic monks and nuns would go and witness and have meaningful spiritual encounters. And this was explained in Celtic Christianity as being deliberate. It was intentional. There was a real desire to go into nature. Here we have St. Cuthbert with two otters drying his feet, one of many, many examples of animals and saints kind of wrapping around each other. And Bede, who was very close to Celtic spirituality in a way, although he was from a Roman tradition, culturally, a lot of what the Anglo-Saxons like Bede were saying was very similar. And he actually explained why saints would go into nature. He gave us a kind of little theology of it. And he writes, not only the creatures of the air, but also of the sea, yes, and even the sea itself, as well as air and fire, as we have shown above, did honour the venerable man, St. Cuthbert in this instance. For if a man faithfully and wholeheartedly serves the maker of all created things, it is no wonder, though all creation should minister to his commands and wishes. So he's saying that if you're very holy and devout towards God, you'll find that nature starts behaving in a benign way towards you. That's his argument anyway. He was explaining why Celtic spirituality was so wrapped in nature. And then he went on, for the most part, we lose dominion over the creation which was made subject to us because we ourselves neglect to serve the Lord and creator of all things. So he's saying that largely we have an antagonistic relationship with nature because of our sin, basically because of the fall. That's what he's alluding to here. Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and then nature itself became hostile to human beings. This is quite a common theology in the early church. You'll see it quite often. I mean, Augustine picked this up, and a lot of early church leaders would have this theology, what you could call a kind of antagonism, that there was kind of a universal corruption took place at the fall. So nature fell away and nature started to become hostile. But so that's quite common in kind of patristic writing. But what is unusual in Celtic spirituality is they actually said that by being holy, by really being obedient to God, you could actually start to reverse that here and now. So you could actually kind of almost touch back on that, what they called, Bede uses the phrase even, first creation. Elsewhere in his he wrote a book about Genesis. So there was a first creation, a kind of benign harmony between us and nature, which would occasionally break through, and the early kind of Celtic monks and nuns would demonstrate that. They would show that there was this original order and harmony. By being very holy, nature would start to act in a slightly different way around them to show that kind of original purity. And that, to my mind, is one of the most distinctive arguments of Celtic spirituality. That's what I kind of excavated through my PhD work anyway. And I was very interested with John Wesley to look at what he said about nature and animals. Famously, he was a vegetarian, but he didn't try to make any point about that. But as a very mature kind of, in his late years, he did start to kind of, as a lot of people do when they, in later writings, he did start to try and integrate more of his thoughts. And he did write and talk about animals in a way that I think kind of gets close to this Celtic spirituality. He certainly was he wasn't a Calvinist. And I think some of this is, I'm going to finish by presenting some of his talk about nature. He did believe in this idea that the natural world was also a kind of like where spirituality and devotion are played out. And he said, this is from his Sermon 60, The General Deliverance, great piece of writing. He wrote, how he said, how true then is that word, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. How far is this from being the present case? In what a condition is the whole lower world, to say nothing of inanimate nature, wherein all the elements seem to be out of course, and by turns to fight against man. So he did have this sense there that nature was hostile. And I'll conclude by saying he did kind of bring back, there was this sense, loving obedience to God was the perfection of man, so a loving obedience to man was a perfection of brutes. So he did believe that there was this kind of harmony going backwards and forwards. We are good, we obey God, nature will obey us. And his conclusion was very much that this is a state of harmony that will be returned eventually, and he's looking ahead to a kind of, as he said, the general deliverance. So he didn't argue. He was said, my quote, I've underlined it here, he would look forward beyond this present scene of bondage, where we're slaves to sin and to disorder and to antagonism and to predation, which was a large part of the fall. Animals started eating each other and so on. We'd look forward to the happy time where they were delivered therefrom into the liberty of the children of God. So he wasn't quite going as far as the Celtic Christians to say that this was all going to be redeemed, could be redeemed in the here and now, but he did have a positive long-term view, eschatological view of nature. So I do wonder, perhaps, if spending all that time out in the fresh air did him rather more good than he